almost like she knew she was being videoed.
She's like, I want to be on video.
Woo,
All right, let's go. Let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila. Didn't like that. Almost like she knew she was being videoed.
She's like, I want to be on video.
Woo,
All right, let's go. Let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila.
Hello, Internet, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of my Ask Me Anything on the Internet. And hopefully, if you got here early, then you saw some silly videos of my dogs. I figured that was way more entertaining for you than waiting around watching a blue screen, just staring at the blue screen, like the blue screen of death, which I totally did not intend for that video to be blue. But hopefully you enjoyed waiting a little bit. These live events, you got to wait for everybody to show up and got to get people in there, right? So tonight I am doing this in the evenings on East Coast U.S. time because in the United States we have this thing Thanksgiving, and so it takes up like a big old weekend of eating and drinking and fun. So want to do this before the holidays begin and wanted to talk to you about Docker. So this week we're going to talk a little bit again about the Docker release 1809, big news, the semi-annual release now, basically, of Docker. And then a few other headlines, some things that have been going on. And then we're going to get to questions. So the way this works is you throw your questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat as we get to that point in the conversation. And I will basically go top down. So the order matters. The faster you get your questions in, and you can ask as many as you want. I don't always have all the right answers, but we can certainly try, and I can, look around the internet if I'm guessing on the answer to make sure I'm getting you the right information. The goal here is several-fold. It's to provide a little bit of fun and information around DevOps, Docker, containers, Kubernetes, all those things, right? This is also for students in my course, which is about to hit 80,000 people on the Docker Mastery course as well as the Swarm Mastery course. Those are coming to almost up to 2 years now on the Docker Mastery course. So we're not quite to the 2-year birthday mark on that, but 80,000 is crazy. And it's hard to imagine that there was a point in time which I wasn't even sure if anybody would want to watch it. So thank you so much. If you're a student, if you've bought those courses on Udemy, you can get everything, or at least almost everything that I'm going to talk about that's mine tonight at brettfisher.com/Docker. I will show you that in a minute on the website, and I'll put that link in the chat when we get to the conversation. But the first thing I want to do is talk about my next course, which I've mentioned for the last few weeks, Docker for NodeJS. So I thought I would perform a little magic and talk about Docker for Node.js. That's a course that I've been working all month and the last couple of months actually with the team on building out the content for this. And the goal here is if you are already or beginning to be a Node.js fan and you're maybe playing around with Node or you've done Node for a while and maybe you've even done Docker for a while, the goal here is to take those sort of 101 concepts of Node and Docker and combine them for people that already know both Maybe you've taken my Docker Mastery course and you're a Node developer, and you want to sort of take your skills to the next level. You want to understand the nuances of local development with Node and making sure that debugging works and everything's running in containers. And then how do you marry that with production and making sure that your images are minimal and secure and stable, and rolling updates work well during your update cycle for your Node apps, all those little things, right? And it turns out that there's a lot of stuff there. So I realized I should put it in a course. It's more than just a couple of blog posts, and that's going to be coming out soon. So it's not going to be ready for Black Friday. So hold off a little bit of your money after Black Friday, and we'll have that course out here pretty soon. And you'll be able to buy it with a coupon if you're on my newsletter. That's brettfisher.com/newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter there, or if you read the emails from Udemy, either one, you will get a coupon from me for the usual discount on the Udemy courses, and you'll be able to get those at the best rate possible. And on to the other news. So we have some stuff here on my website. I just mentioned real quick the Docker resources I'll probably talk about several times tonight. All my courses are going to be here. Other stuff like, of course, this YouTube channel and all that stuff. But enough about that. Check that out in case you aren't on the lists and the things that you need to find me. So over at Sysdig, this week, they send out a nice newsletter every so often. And if you're not familiar with Sysdig, they're a monitoring company, and they're specializing in containers. So they sent out an update to their security tool list. And I think there's a lot of confusion around containers and security. Really, a lot of security doesn't change with containers. You still have to do proper patching of your hosts, and now also proper patching in your containers. And obviously, you've got to keep your apps as secure as you can. And then all the normal security tools that you might employ, they still need to be done in containers, or at least with your container technology. But there's other stuff that you can take advantage of with containers, like scanning your images for known vulnerabilities inside the images, because maybe a Docker image isn't easily viewable by a host scanner of some sort if you're using something like that. So the nice thing is with Sysdig is that it's not only sort of a comparison of tools, it's just an awareness. I mean, honestly, when they first released this a year ago, and now that they've updated it in the end of 2018, I didn't know about all these tools. I hadn't heard of all of them. There's so much innovation happening in the container community. So they have a nice, now it's an alphabeticalized list. It's this crazy looking list of tools, and I'm sure they're only scratching the surface, but these are the big ones. And they've bolded their own tools because they are trying to incorporate more security features into their monitoring product, because I think security and monitoring go hand in hand a little bit, you know? So the ones that I'm sort of a fan of on 101, I would actually talk about over in my AMA. So yes, you're on a YouTube Ask Me Anything, but also I have an offline, well, it's technically online, but it's not live. It's off live Ask Me Anything that's over on GitHub. And so over on GitHub /BrettFisher/AMA/issues is sort of a place for people to ask me random questions, mostly about Docker and containers, but sometimes about careers and DevOps, stuff like that. And then we have a conversation. I tend to answer them as best as I can, and then other people might chime in. And one of those is about security. And it's really about, let's see. Yeah, this is it. It's really about how do you get started? How do you get started with security when you're starting to do containers, right? And I think it's really hard sometimes, well, in every part of IT, but especially in security, it's tricky to make sure you don't jump to some insane security tool that's going to be really hard to use and really burden your team with maybe a lot of lockdown procedures or something when you haven't even taken into account the basics, right? So on this post, and I'll throw this in the chat in YouTube, on this post, I do mention this quite often, and oh, did that get in there? I do mention this quite often, actually, because it's sort of what I mean to be a first stop, right? It's like where you want to go as a 101. And really, out of the gate, the trick is make sure you're doing what Docker already has built in. And make sure that you're enabling the security features or just using Docker in general. Because if you're using the latest versions of Docker, you're getting a lot of security features out of the box that you wouldn't even get if you weren't using containers. So this post is meant to sort of talk about the things that you want to start in order of easy to more difficult, more time consuming, and probably more costly in terms of delaying your projects. Because the last thing you want to do is have a production project where you're trying to get something into production and then to put a bunch of delays into the project because of new added security requirements. So the levels here, as you go down this list, they will get more complicated as you go, and they get more difficult to implement and operate. So hopefully that'll help you out. Let me throw that. Doesn't look like it went into chat. Let me. Seems like the chat is not wanting to behave tonight. All right, well, the way to find that is over on github.com/brettfisher/AMA/issues/17. I will make sure that that's in the updated show notes when this actually gets posted to my website and to YouTube. So all these videos, by the way, now get put into YouTube in a playlist called Ask Me Anything, and you can watch these after they're live in case you've missed them. All right, so after this, we're going to get to the questions. Let me see if I can't figure out chat real quick to make sure that I've got everything working there as expected. There we go. Yeah, I don't know why the chat wasn't working there. Okay. So on to the questions. So the way this works is I try to answer your question, and of course there's a little delay, right? We got a lag on the internet. So if I don't get to your questions in the hour, I will answer them in chat afterwards. So the chat outlives the video. So if we run out of time in this hour chat, then just hang on for a little bit longer, and I will be answering those in the chat in the YouTube webpage. If I answer your question, but it's not complete and you have more questions, just throw those back in the chat at the end and I'll get to them as I scroll down. But I'm basically going from a top-down order. Let's see. And because it's the evening edition, I've got my evening edition Docker cider in case you're somewhere where it's happy hour. Get your questions in early. That was me saying that. Jero says, amazing. Okay, thank you. Michael says, looking forward to this. Thanks, Michael. Justin says, this is late enough. I finally get to attend one of these. I know, Justin, I've been thinking about alternating them Tuesday evenings and Thursday mornings. So let me know in the chat if this is a much better time for any of you that are on here. And I will try to do the Tuesday nights more often, because we normally do this on East Coast America Thursday mornings. Josh is back again. All right, Justin's back with a question. How do you best deal with companies that post their containers on Docker Hub but don't conform with the normal documentation? I'm looking at Elastic here. Everyone else seems to cleanly provide paths to configs and the like in the README, not them. Justin, I believe that Elastic is actually moved their official containers to a different place than Docker Hub. So companies like Microsoft, Oracle, Red Hat, Elastic are the ones that I can think of. These big, large companies that have lots of software might maybe have some containers on, or images rather, on Docker Hub, but they're going to be moving their stuff off to their official. So if you look, let me just Google that. Yeah, so in fact, they might even say it. Let's see over here. Let's see if this is it. Yeah, so if you go to docker.elastic.co, you get a list of their official images, and they're not living on Docker Hub. You'll notice that the URL is via their own hosted registry. And I'm sure they have their own reasons for doing this. Maybe the Docker infrastructure, while free, wasn't fast enough for them. I don't really know. So you will want to check those out over there and then look at their documentation on their own website. If there's anything available on Docker Hub at this point, it may just be old. I know the Docker Hub's Elastic official images are old and due to be sort of deprecated. Samir, is Ansible really necessary if you're already setting up your Docker files away before deploying it? Anyway, before deploying it. So Samir, Ansible is great for provisioning infrastructure and things like Terraform, Salt, Puppet, those kind of things. Those are good at server and infrastructure management. Docker does not do that. So if you've got something that's already spinning up your virtual machines in the cloud or wherever you're hosting them, and they're putting Docker on it, you got to have the right version of Docker, making sure that your Docker engines are consistent across all your nodes and that you're using a stable version, yada, yada. If you've got that all set up and you're not using Ansible, then you probably don't need Ansible to deploy Docker containers. That being said, if you're not using orchestration and you're just running a bunch of servers with Docker on them and not either Swarm or Kubernetes on top of them, then you probably are going to need something else to help orchestrate all the changes, right? If you're in AWS, you might just use auto-scaling groups and the cloud init scripts that are for startup of instances. You could kind of get away with doing that and maybe just some simple CloudFormations templates and not having to use something like CloudFormation or Ansible or Salt or Puppet or Chef or whatever. But honestly, at the end of the day, I think it really depends on the size of your team. If it's just you and it's just pet projects or side projects, you just have a few servers, then you probably don't need all that automation. But as you grow, and especially as you become a team of DevOps people, you're certainly going to need some tool to manage your infrastructure, and Docker is not going to solve all those problems for you. It's great at deploying and managing your applications, but not necessarily the infrastructure underneath it. I hope that helps. Good question, though. A question I get a lot. Michael, is there a trick to setting up UCP on GCP IP encapsulated protocol? I don't know, Michael. I've never actually used a Docker Enterprise. So your question is specifically, how do you run Docker Enterprise on GCP? So I have not seen a guide on that. What I would do if I were you is I would look on the Success portal, because that's where all the Docker Enterprise documentation is at. I know they have guides on here for AWS, VMware, and Azure. I don't know about Google. So you might have to contact if you're using UCP, then you're probably paying for it, unless you're just on a demo. But if you're paying for it, you can certainly contact Docker and ask them for any GCP guidance. In fact, we can just search here. Yeah. And it mentions it, but it doesn't look like it's necessarily a guide for how to set up Google Cloud. So I don't really have an answer for you. I've never actually deployed Docker Enterprise on Google, so I can't tell you off the top of my head. Samir, what's the best way to configure Jenkins in a Kubernetes environment? There aren't any good tutorials that show how to set up Kubernetes with Jenkins. I'm using an on-premise non-HA environment. All right, Samir, I don't see why you would use Jenkins to set up Kubernetes infrastructure unless you were maybe setting it up, tearing it down, setting it up, tearing it down as a part of some sort of batch job related to your other Jenkins work. Normally, you're going to use a Kubernetes deployment tool, and there's now lots of them. There's at least 5 that I could probably rattle off the top of my head. And you would use all of those tools because they're going to need to be the tools that set up etcd and install all the Kubernetes API services and configure the host properly, make sure Docker's installed, right? So all those things have to be configured, and the SSL certificates and whatnot, that all has to be done. And so you're going to need some sort of management tool like that. Ones down here that I have, let's see. No, that's not it. Yeah, so like I've got a short little list, and this isn't even all of them, but you've got kubespawn, kops, kubecorn. There's technically Kubernetes the hard way. That's not actually a it's not actually a deployment tool. That is more of you learning the manual setup process, so you have much more understanding of what's going on in the background when you do a deployment of Kubernetes. So what I would do is if you needed to do automated setup through Jenkins and basically spin up and tear down Kubernetes clusters, then you would probably have probably have Jenkins running one of these tools. And then these tools would do the automated deployment inside of a Kubernetes workflow, right? Not Kubernetes the hard way, but one of these other ones, kubespray. And, honestly, there's lots of other tools out there, and I don't actually keep track of all of them because it's a little overwhelming at times. So I would say try a couple. There's really not one that's best for all scenarios. And so try one of these tools, see which one meets your needs, which one matches the cloud you're using or the vendor tools you're using, and then see if you can't orchestrate that into your pipelines inside of Jenkins if you need to use Jenkins. Hope that helps. All right, who's next? Ravina. Hi, which Docker certification would you recommend held in high esteem in the industry? Well, there is only one Docker certification. There's Docker Certified Associate, the DCA, and that's meant to be around Docker Enterprise. If you are talking about a container specific certification, I would say that it depends on where you're going to be working and who is going to be, what you're going to be working on. If you're going to be working on Kubernetes, the CNCF has certifications now on Kubernetes. And you can just Google that to find information about those. There's several. There's the administrator, and then there's the application developer. Probably would want to go for the administrator first if you're focused on DevOps and trying to administrate a Kubernetes cluster. Docker Enterprise certification is about the Docker stack of tools, so learning Docker Engine, learning Swarm, and I don't think they've yet incorporated the DCA with the newer functionality around Kubernetes. So I would say that in an industry whole, in terms of just you want to be a DevOps person and you want to stay up to date with containers, I would say get one cloud vendor certification. The most popular would be AWS, and then get the CNCF Kubernetes administrator certification. So those, if you could only pick two, I would probably pick the AWS cloud, one of the cloud certifications on AWS that's most aligned with your experience and your skills, and then the CNCF one. If you're working for a company that was specifically using Docker Enterprise and was paying for Docker Enterprise, then go get the DCA, right? That's going to help you the most in that job, and it'll help you get jobs with that. I think eventually, as you start to stack up the list of certifications, you're probably going to want a Linux certification in there if you're going to be in a Linux shop. Obviously, Windows certifications if you're going to be in a Windows shop, so that you have basically the OS, the cloud, and then the orchestrator, and sort of a certification in all three levels. You don't necessarily need all the certifications. At some point in my career, people stopped asking about certifications because I had so much experience and so many certifications that more weren't helping me, right? So if you're just getting started, obviously, though, you want to get a couple big ones, and I would say AWS and the CNCF are some of the big ones. Good question. Christopher asked, does running Jenkins in a container a part of a swarm that deploys containers to the swarm make sense? Is that a bad practice? No, that is not a bad practice. I think you're not going to have Jenkins creating the swarm. You're just going to have Jenkins spinning up containers inside the swarm to do Jenkins jobs, right? And that's, I believe there's actually some built-in functionality. There's modules, I think they are. I keep forgetting whether they're plugins or modules in Jenkins. But there's some for that allow Jenkins to talk to the Docker socket, and then it can spin up services inside a swarm. So I think if you just did some Googling on that, you probably could find what you need to do there. And no, that's totally normal. I would say running Jenkins inside of Docker and then having it dynamically spin up other containers to run Jenkins is a little tricky. And so realize that maybe that's not, that's not maybe your day one goal. But once you get it working, yeah, it works great. Good questions. Alfredo, hey, Brett, is there any impact if I use multi-stage Docker builds inside a Jenkins or any other CI/CD pipeline? I want to give it a test drive soon. Great question. No, multi-stage, the only requirement is that you have at least Docker 1706, which was, I think, the first release to support multi-stage builds. So the Docker engine that's going to be used to create those images needs to just be that version. And that version's now over a year old. If you're running sort of stock Red Hat stuff, you got to be careful because stock Red Hat might be running even really old versions like 1.13 that won't support it. I'm pretty sure that if you just hand build your servers and make sure that you have the latest Docker, you'll be fine. But yes, I've done that before and it works fine. Samir, looking forward to the Node course for sure. Thank you. I'm excited to get it released and to get feedback on it. So I'm a big fan of Node, so I'm glad that the community is going to be able to learn the best way to do Docker on Node. So I'm glad you're excited too. What would have been nice if it was Kubernetes/Jenkins deployment as well? Well, I mean, do realize that even just a Kubernetes course is going to be even more complex than my Docker course because Kubernetes has a lot more moving parts to it, and it is quite a job to be able to teach someone how to deploy and use even just half of the features in Kubernetes, right? So that will be a course that I'm going to be focusing on next, but it was much easier for me to get a course out here in 2018 by just doing the Docker for Node.js. Kubernetes was going to take a lot longer because it's going to have to be a much more complex course, and I'm actually going to be bringing on some help for that, so we're going to get some more expertise in that course that I'll be talking about when that course gets closer to being released. So expect to hear some announcements about that. But I'm excited that you're excited about that. I think CI/CD is probably in the future, talking about continuous integration tools and deployment tools. Really, that's a separate course, honestly, because you're talking about not just Jenkins, because Jenkins is obviously just one of many tools that people have used to deploy containers. Lots of people might use GoCD or Drone or Travis or AWS. Built-in stuff, there's CodeShip, CodeShip is now owned by a Jenkins company. So there's lots of tools there, including even Azure ones. And I want to give not just a Jenkins course because I'm not a Jenkins expert. So I really want to be able to give some people some examples of different CI/CD tools and how you might do it different ways in different tools. And then that way you can get started with it and get through some of the hard hurdles up front and then go from there. So that's my plan. I don't have an ETA for any of those courses, but yeah, definitely. We're definitely going to do that. Alfredo, please name the 5 tools that you remember to deploy to Kubernetes. Yeah, so I will just put the links in here. Let's see. KOps is one. KubeSpawn is another. Kubicorn. And I'm sure there's other ones that people here could probably mention that I'm forgetting. KubeSpray. And some are good at the cloud, at cloud vendors actually spinning up instances in the cloud. Some don't do that. Some maybe automatically set up high availability. Some might not do that. So it just kind of depends on which tool you want. Ravina, are Ansible containers with container YAML preferred over Docker Compose? No, I look at, that's an interesting question you asked. So you're really asking Ansible or Docker Compose. So are we talking about the tool or the file format? I would assume that you're talking about the tool, and Ansible is more of a production infrastructure tool. Docker Compose, the tool, not the file format, but the tool, Docker-Compose, is designed for local development, not designed for servers in production. I actually talk about that in my Ask Me Anything on GitHub. I think it's issue 6. Let's see if I can remember it. Yeah, 8. I was wrong. Issue 8. So I'll send you this link. So issue 8 in GitHub. And really what that is going to answer is the details are in there. I know you didn't ask about Swarm, but the details in there are about why you don't want to use Docker Compose in production. It only understands a single node, the one it's on, and it was never designed to be a tool running running in a long instance on a server in the background. It was designed to be a local development and workflow tool, so for you to run containers locally very easily for development and testing, and then maybe using it in CI for testing and spinning up containers that way. But when you get to production, you're going to either use an orchestrator like Kubernetes or Swarm. And if you're not doing that, you might use Ansible. And you might even use Ansible with those if you don't want to use the commands of those tools and you maybe already have a standard of Ansible. But if you don't have Ansible today, I'm not sure, and you don't need Ansible today, then there's not a reason to have Ansible for container deployment. I would say use an orchestrator for that. Learn an orchestrator. It's probably going to be more feasible for you to scale and manage multiple applications that way than to try to do them with Ansible. Because Ansible's a one-shot thing, right? So it's not going to make decisions like a Swarm or a Kubernetes would about how to deploy containers and where to put them and how to restart them and all that kind of stuff. So it's hard to compare the two because they do different things. Hopefully that helps. Daniel, we had Jenkins create swarms via Ansible for scripted deployments. Yes, Daniel, it's a lot of nested tools there. Jenkins uses Ansible to create Swarm. Yeah, so I don't see a lot of people setting up automated orchestration, mostly because once you have the orchestration set up, you might use Ansible to create new nodes to add for capacity reasons or something, but the orchestrator usually manages all the applications after that. So I don't see a lot of people using Ansible to avoid using Swarm commands or Kubernetes commands from the command line. But you can do it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It just adds a little level of complexity there. I was going to say layer of complexity. Conrad, hello. I cannot wait for your Kubernetes course. I'm currently working through your Docker Mastery course. Thank you so much. I'm excited. I wish I could work 24 hours a day and produce faster courses so that we'd all had everything done already. Mike, I am looking for some resources. How can I use common images across applications such as MySQL, Redis across different projects? Hi, Mike. Some resource. How can I use common images across applications such as MySQL, Redis? So are you asking, Mike, how can you have a consolidated database container and then use multiple applications with that container? Because if that's the case, then it would depend on your orchestrator and how you were designing your applications, but it wouldn't change much from when you were using it before containers. If you needed, for example, on Swarm, if you needed to use a MySQL database with lots of different other stacks of applications, then you would create a stack, which is a compose file, with just your database, and it would be on a special database network. And then any application that needed to use that database server would also need to be on that same database network, as well as maybe their own application network in Swarm. And you would just need to, they would all use the same DNS name inside of the Swarm overlay networks. On Kubernetes, it would depend on your networking driver, but it would be largely the same thing. Your deployments would all just point to the same database server wherever you've got that running via DNS. And yeah, it would kind of just work. So it doesn't change the model necessarily per se. You don't necessarily have to spin up a single database server for each application. I think a lot of internet examples give us that impression, but that's not necessarily the case. It's still best practice if you are running a large system to use databases and the memory that they're using for optimization across multiple applications. Obviously, running 1 or 2 large database servers versus dozens of small ones is probably a little easier in terms of backups and maintenance and whatnot. But I always recommend that if you're getting started on the cloud, to just try and use the cloud vendors' database technology. Just because we have containers doesn't mean that we all can be better database administrators than Amazon and Azure. So if you have a chance to use something like AWS's RDS, then absolutely use that first. They do automatic failover, automatic backups, automatic monitoring, all the things that you would have to then on your own worry about if you were going to deploy your own database containers. So, and I think at the end of the day, people look at the prices of them and think it's more expensive, but honestly, the amount of time you're going to spend managing that database and its backups and its monitoring, I think it's definitely going to be cheaper to use the cloud vendors if you include the total cost of maintaining those databases. All right, who's next? Mike is back. I'm equally eager for the Kubernetes. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the vote. I'm excited to get that started and get that out in the new year. Samir, what is your Linux setup? Do you typically work in a Linux environment with i3, GNOME, Awesome, and Tmux, or Screen? And what editor, Vim, Emacs? And what are your thoughts on these from your experience? Okay, I would say the best resource, it's a good question, to see my setup, at least at the shell, is brettfisher.com/shell. And I will send this link into the chat, because it has a list of, if you've ever taken my courses, you've probably seen some of my more advanced shell setup. And I list all the tools I use here. I'm on a Mac, so I will be using iTerm2, which is a really good Mac terminal emulator. And then it goes down from there. I even get into esoteric stuff like the fonts that I use in the shell, the mods I use in my fonts, like Nerd Fonts, which is a really fantastic sort of hack on a bunch of open source fonts where they add in the glyphs and all the extra stuff that makes your fonts awesome. And they actually include Font Awesome and other things all inside your single font for your system. And those fonts would work on any OS, any modern OS. And then I go into things like how I customize my prompt, how I customize my themes of the shell. I'm a Vim person, so I talk a lot about my Vim here. I mostly use Space Vim, which I'm a huge fan of. Will work on Mac, Linux, and Windows. It is a distribution of Vim that it's a sort of a package manager distribution of Vim, and it specializes on using NVim, if you've heard of that, which is an actual different build of Vim than the original Vim, and it's trying to be the modern Vim. Anyway, all those links are all on that page. Definitely check that out. I would still use almost all these tools if I was running Linux all day. My preferred desktop of Linux is either Mint or Enlightenment. I'm also a FreeBSD and Gentoo fan, but I think right now my Linux VM for desktop stuff is just running Mint Cinnamon, in case you're curious on that. But I'm mostly on my Mac all day. All right, next question. Daniel, when using Portainer, do you always use the Portainer agent or do you run without it? Daniel, I think the Portainer agent is awesome, and I always try to use it. It allows you to see, especially because you're probably using Portainer because you have multiple machines, and the Portainer agent allows you to see the local volumes, networks, let's see, what else? Images, like it lets you see the things that are not swarm wide on each node. And you couldn't normally get that without the agent. You wouldn't be able to see into the local volumes of each node, and the agent allows you to do that. So I always recommend using the agent. Great question. Alfredo's back. Those are more for cluster deployments. My question was more oriented in the pipeline. Once I have the container, what's the best way to start a deployment of the new container? By manifest, kube control? Okay, that's an interesting question. I'm going to have to look back at your other question because I've already forgotten what we were talking about. Let me look back up here real quick. Okay, so yeah, I'm thinking you're talking about your Jenkins CI/CD pipeline. Yeah. Sorry, Daniel. I'm already forgetting what that question was about. Those are more for cluster deployments. My question was more oriented in the pipeline. Once I have the container, what's the best way to start a deployment of the new container? Is this okay, so you're saying kube control, so I'm wondering if this is a Kubernetes question specifically. And it just depends on, kube control, depending on which side of that fence you're on, that would be a preferred tool for running it. It depends on whether you're doing, maybe you're running a higher level tool, maybe you're running Docker Enterprise, which allows you to use stacks on top of that. Maybe you're using something like Helm. It kind of depends on which higher level tooling you have there and whether you need that. If you are kubectl is sort of the standard way, I would say, to issue a deployment. If you're using replica sets, jobs, stuff like that. So sorry if I'm confused about exactly what your question is. You can always try to ask it again at the end, and I'll happily get to it. Jero, sorry if I mispronounced that, or Jero. What do you think about ECS versus Kubernetes? Well, ECS can run Kubernetes, so I'm not sure what your question is. I would say those are two different ways to run containers. Swarm is another one. You can use Rancher on top of Kubernetes. When you say Kubernetes, the challenge nowadays is that there's multiple distributions of Kubernetes, kind of like there's multiple distributions of Linux. So I think the way that you use Kubernetes nowadays is very much, you should always be using a higher level tool. I don't ever recommend to anyone who's doing this for a real business, for real production, to roll their own upstream Kubernetes. I really advise, unless you have a team of 3 to 5 diehard Kubernetes experts that are going to spend their entire life doing this, that you use a higher level tool like Docker Enterprise, Rancher, Fargate. I haven't had a chance to use DigitalOcean's Kubernetes yet, but Azure, they've all got tooling to automate and manage your cluster setup. And I recommend you use those tools, because doing it yourself can get you in, not only is it a lot of work, but it can actually cause potential security vulnerabilities. And it's just it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of ways you could do it wrong. So I don't recommend you use pure upstream Kubernetes if you're doing this seriously for a business and you want to keep it secure and stable and highly available. Because I think a lot of examples you see on the internet are really just deploying a single server that's not highly available, that's not storing encrypted certificates. And that's why all these deployment tools have started to show up, is to make sure that stuff's happening, because you need that. Like, I think that one of the core premises of any orchestrator, even in small environments for business, is that it should be encrypted, it should be secure authentication, and it should be highly available at the orchestrator level, so that no single node will take down your entire cluster. So I think that's a hard question to answer. ECS is perfectly fine if it solves your problems, right? At the end of the day, these are all tools. So if Swarm solves your problems, use that. If ECS solves your problems already, and you don't have other problems to solve, then there's no reason to switch to Kubernetes, right? In terms of upstream raw Kubernetes. So Kubernetes on AWS has several different flavors. So if you are trying to move to a Kubernetes platform and you are already on AWS, then you probably would default to using theirs and looking at their options on ECS and Fargate, and then evaluating whether or not that's going to work for you. So I don't, at the end of the day, I don't feel like it's fair to compare features, because it's, I think, a larger picture around the expertise of your team, how big is your team, what's your budget, and what do you really need. A lot of people don't need Kubernetes. You don't need the high-end complexity of a Kubernetes environment. That's why a lot of people get away with using Swarm, which is a much easier tool to deploy and manage, because it just doesn't, they don't need all of the extra features that come out of the box with Kubernetes. So I always prefer a simpler tool rather than a complex tool that can be possibly used for things I don't need, right? Hopefully that helps. Sorry. Ravina orchestrator as in Mesos or Kubernetes? I'm not sure if you're answering his question or not. Yeah. I mean, Mesos nowadays, most people are running, unless you're a telco, most people are running Kubernetes on Mesos, if they're running Mesos, or DCOS rather. I'm assuming that's what you mean by Mesos. Mesosphere is their commercial product. Mike is back. Yes, I am looking for locally sharing MySQL resources managed by Docker Compose. Yeah. So I would spin up a MySQL Docker Compose project, and then I would go to another directory and run those projects. And I would just make sure they're all in the same Docker network. So you would manually specify the Docker networks in each Compose file, and maybe hand create, either have sort of have one where you always start it first and it creates the Docker network, or spin up the Docker network manually on your own and then have each Compose file use those networks. And that's how you can have multiple Compose files use the same networks there. I do the same thing very often for front-end proxies like traffic, where I will create the proxy network first, and then my proxy application goes on that proxy network, and then every application that needs web proxy also then attaches to that network through an external, the external reference inside of your Compose file. I hope that helps. Emmanuel's back. Or hello, Emmanuel. I'm not sure if you've asked a question yet. Have you ever talked about autoscale in Swarm? Is it going to be a new feature in the next release? I don't. So autoscale, I don't see any features. I mean, Swarm is open source just like Kubernetes, so I haven't seen any PRs that are autoscale. So when you say autoscale, what I assume you mean is tasks inside a Swarm service, and you can do autoscale with other tools. The thing that you have to think about with autoscale is that autoscale means that something has to monitor. Usually, it's performance autoscaling, right? Has to monitor that stuff and then keep metrics over time and then make decisions on those metrics. And the Docker engine, I'm not going to say it's never going to do that because who knows the future, but that would be a lot of work to add that functionality into the Docker engine to start storing metrics over time and then make decisions based on CPU performance and whatnot. So what I see people doing is using the Swarm API with a higher level tool like Prometheus, and having Prometheus alerts simply spin up one more container, adding an additional replica or spinning it down based on performance. And you can probably Google around and find that. I think I've seen Alex Ellis maybe has done a demo on that. Alexellis. If you just look on Alex's website, he might have a demo on autoscale. So if you're talking about autoscale at the node level, so physical instances, you can do that in your cloud provider. So if you're in AWS, I would just say use autoscaling groups, create one for your managers, one for your workers, set CPU alerts or whatever your alerts are, memory or disk IO, whatever. And then when those nodes spin up, you're going to use the cloud init script to automatically add them to the Swarm. And then you have to decide whether you're going to rebalance, which is another issue that when you add new instances to an orchestrator, it's not going to automatically move a bunch of working and running containers over to that node. So if that's the expectation, that's known as a rebalance, and you then need to take that into account and maybe have some scripts that will do a force an update on your services in order to readjust and move containers to new nodes. So hopefully that's a little summary. Hopefully that'll get you started if you're looking to do that. But it's totally all possible. It's just not built in out of the box. Mike, thanks. Thank you for the depth. Thanks, Mike. So glad I'm able to finally join. Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it. I hope you can attend the next ones if I do another one on Tuesdays, if that's best for you. Ravina's back. It's 7 a.m. here in India, and a great start to my morning. Thanks, Brett. Okay, thanks, Ravina. Raphael says, any resource or guide to orchestrate MongoDB with Swarm? Interesting. So I would say look up autopilot pattern. So I would look up autopilot. Autopilotpattern.io is a website, but you can really just Google it. So you can do like autopilot Mongo, and you'll probably come up with some resources that what it is it's usually a compose file, which will work in Swarm, that helps automate the setup of each of the replicas. And that's really what you got to worry about is if you want an auto magical setup of Mongo, you need to have it auto set up with like some JavaScript files, that replica setup, and making sure that it adds the replicas to your replica set. And I don't have a sort of my own, because I think there's other ones out there that you can probably use just by searching the autopilot pattern. And you might also look up Docker Compose replica set Mongo, something like that. But first, check out this one underneath autopilot and see if that one might help you get close. And of course, if you make something, always try to share it with me, because if you can open source it, of course, the community, we all benefit from each other sharing stuff. So if you've got it working and you know this works, feel free to share it with me on Twitter or something, and I'd love to check it out and get it out to the community if it's something that you think would benefit others. Mike, that's what I was thinking, but wanted to be sure. So as simple as sharing a network. Yeah, Mike, that's what you would yeah, exactly. It's that easy. Conrad, yeah, the video will be available later. Samir, is it a good idea to get CKA certified and AWS certified? I only have 2.5 years of software engineering experience, and I want to get a DevOps job. I haven't been in the workforce for 2 years, though. Thanks, Mike. Samir, yes, I think at this point, a cloud certification is pretty key, and AWS is the largest, and they have the most well-defined certification program. Obviously, there's Azure. It kind of depends on which ecosystem you're going to be in. If you know, there are people that are focused on Windows DevOps, there's people that are focused on Linux DevOps. So I would say, even though you can run Windows or Linux on both of the clouds, I would say more enterprise Windows people tend to go to Azure, and then more cloud, everyone else just kind of goes to AWS, right? So I would say getting an AWS certificate to get you started is the right way to go. Pick an easy one that would be the most aligned with your skill set. Don't necessarily try to go for the hardest one first, and just have something, right? I think certificates are a good thing to hand to a job interview. Just having those on hand is great, to have those with your resume, or at least a list of them, and maybe some URLs to help people validate. I think once you get into the community and you have enough jobs, then it's all word of mouth at that point. Usually you'll be able to have people refer you, and you'll have recommendations and stuff like that. So certificates and certifications and other things at that point are not necessarily as critical. But when you're going for jobs where you don't know anyone there, and you don't have a lot of people to refer you or to recommend you rather, then certifications are the way to go. Yeah. All right, so we're going to wrap this up. It is almost 9 o'clock here in the United States. So thank you so much for coming. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. If you want to know about whenever I do these Ask Me Anythings, click the little dinner bell right next to subscribe, and that will alert you when these AMAs happen. And I do them almost every week that I can. And I usually do them on Thursdays, but sometimes you never know. It might be on a Tuesday night. And again, if you need any other resources, check out my site and Docker resources, most of which are free, at brettfisher.com/Docker. And I'll see you next time on the internet.